The 13th Child, the Acid Bogs. My name is Elias. I'm a hydrogeologist contracted by the state to monitor the pH levels in the Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer. Most people think of New Jersey as turnpikes and diners, but the Pine Barrens, the Pine Lands, is a different world entirely. It's over 1 million acres of pitch pines and cedar swamps. The water in the bogs is the color of strong tea, stained dark by the tannins, and the sand is as white as crushed bone. It's a quiet job. I spend my days driving an old 4x4 down fire cuts, narrow sand roads that aren't on any GPS, and wading into the tea-colored water to take samples. You get used to the isolation. You get used to the way the pines muffle sound, creating a dead air that makes your own footsteps sound like they're coming from someone else. 3 days ago, I was deep in the Wharton State Forest, near an abandoned colonial-era iron forge. The sun was dipping low, casting long, spindly shadows across the moss. The air was cooling fast, smelling of damp peat and pine resin. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. I was standing knee-deep in a cedar run, dipping a glass vial into the water, when the bog suddenly started to steam. It wasn't a mist. It was a localized heat, as if something boiling had just been submerged nearby. I checked my thermometer. The water temperature had jumped 15 degrees in seconds. Then, the silence changed. In the pinelands, there's always the sound of the wind in the needles, a soft, persistent shh, but that sound cut out. It was replaced by a high-pitched, vibrating hum that I didn't hear with my ears. I felt it in my sinuses. I looked toward the bank, and that's when I saw the tracks. They were pressed deep into the white sugar sand. They looked like the hooves of a deer, but they were split in 3 places, and the stride was impossible. The prints were 4 feet apart, and they didn't wander. They led in a perfectly straight line from the edge of the swamp directly to my parked truck. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded flat, robbed of its echo by the dense brush. A sound came back from the thicket of stunted pines. It was a whistle, a short, sharp, 2-note blast. It sounded exactly like the tea kettle in my kitchen at home. Wee-oo. I waded out of the water, my boots squelching in the mud. I reached the sand road and followed the tracks to my truck. That's when I saw the wrong element. Something had been sitting on the hood of my vehicle. The heavy steel was dented, pressed inward as if by a massive weight. But it wasn't the dent that stopped my heart. It was the smell. It smelled like a lightning strike ozone, and scorched hair mixed with the cloying sweetness of rotting fruit. I looked at the driver's side window. There was a smear on the glass, a long, oily streak of gray slime, and right in the center of it, a single yellow hair. It was coarse, like a horse's mane, but it was over a foot long. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors. As I reached for the ignition, I looked into the rearview mirror. Something was standing in the middle of the road behind me. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in a tattered, leathery membrane that looked like a rotted coat. It had the head of a horse, but the skull was elongated, the skin stretched so tight over the bone that it looked like parchment. It didn't have eyes. It had 2 glowing, vertical slits of pale yellow light. It tilted its head, and then it opened its mouth. It didn't roar. It spoke in my mother's voice. Elias, the water is too sour. N. I didn't wait for a second sentence. I slammed the truck into reverse, the tires screaming as they fought for traction in the loose sugar sand. The creature didn't move. It just stood there in the center of the road, its tattered, leathery form becoming a blur in my rearview mirror as I backed out. I swung the wheel, shifted into drive, and floored it toward the main fire cut. My hands were fused to the steering wheel. The smell of ozone was inside the cab now, thick enough to make my eyes water. I looked at the dashboard. The digital clock was flickering wildly, the numbers cycling through a sequence that didn't make sense. 13, 13, 13, 13, 13, 13, 13. Then a sound came from above. Clack, clack, clack. It was the sound of something hard, like bone or obsidian striking the roof of the truck. It wasn't a steady weight. It was moving, leaping from the overhanging pine branches and landing on the cab for a split second before pushing off again. I looked out the side window and saw a shadow, long, spindly, and draped in that rotted, wing-like membrane, gliding effortlessly through the stunted canopy. It wasn't flying. It was falling with grace, using the trees as springboards. The radio, which I'd turned off an hour ago, crackled to life. Elias, why are you leaving the sample? Duh, 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 duh. The voice was a distorted mashup of my own voice and the static of a distant weather station. D. P. H. is dropping. Elias, everything is turning to vinegar. I hit a dip in the sand road, the suspension bottoming out with a jarring thud. I looked up through the windshield and slammed on the brakes. The creature was hanging upside down from a massive pitch pine arching over the road. Its horse-like skull was just inches from the glass. Close up, the skin wasn't skin at all. It looked like ancient, waterlogged leather stitched together with silver wire. The yellow slits of its eyes didn't have pupils. They were just hollow windows into a furnace of pale light. It reached out a hand, if you could call it that. It had 4 long, spindly fingers tipped with hooves instead of nails. It tapped on the glass, right in front of my face. Tap, tap, tap. The glass didn't crack. It frosted. A circular patch of white ice bloomed where the creature touched the window, even though the outside air was 70 degrees. 13, it whispered. The word didn't come from its mouth. It came from the air vents of the truck, smelling of old iron and swamp gas. Mother said, I was the last one, but the bog is still hungry. Ass, 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 ass. But the bog, but, 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 but. The creature suddenly lunged, not at me, but at the hood of the truck. It tore the heavy steel latch off like it was made of wet paper and shoved its long skeletal snout into the engine compartment. The truck died instantly. No lights, no power, just the sound of the creature lapping up the battery acid with a wet sandpaper tongue. The silence that followed the engine's death was heavy, filled only with the sound of the creature's wet, rhythmic lapping. I sat in the darkness of the cab, my breath hitching in my chest. The frost on the windshield was spreading, turning the glass into an opaque sheet of white ice that blocked my view of the pines. I knew I couldn't stay in the truck. If it was drinking the battery acid, it was only a matter of time before it looked for a more complex chemistry to consume. I grabbed my heavy field pack and my handheld pH meter, the only thing I had that felt like a weapon, even though it was just a plastic rod. I slowly eased the door open. The hinges, usually silent, let out a shriek that sounded like a dying bird. The creature was gone. The hood of the truck was bent upward, a jagged maw of twisted metal, but the clearing was empty. The air outside had changed. The humid Jersey night had vanished, replaced by a dry, biting cold that smelled sharply of vinegar and ozone. Every time I exhaled, the mist froze midair, falling to the sand like tiny shards of glass. I started to run. My target was a decommissioned fire lookout tower about a mile to the east. It was a steel skeletal structure, high enough to get me off the ground and away from the reach of the bogs. But the sugar sand was like running through deep snow. Every step was a labor, and the silence of the pines was now being punctuated by a new sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound was coming from the brush to my left. It was perfectly synchronized with my own footsteps. When I ran, it ran. When I slowed, it slowed. I stopped. The sound stopped. "I can hear you!" I yelled, my voice cracking in the freezing air. "I can hear you," a voice replied from the shadows. It was a perfect echo of my own voice, but it was layered over the sound of a bubbling swamp. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. The beam hit a cluster of stunted oaks. There, standing among the branches, was a figure. It wasn't the horse-headed creature. It was a man. He was wearing my safety vest. He was holding a clipboard, but his neck was elongated, stretching upward like a stalk of pale, translucent celery, and his head was tilted at an impossible angle. The man didn't have eyes. He had two yellow, vertical slits that pulsed with a dull, rhythmic light. "The water is turning," the man-thing said, using a voice that sounded like my father's. "Mother says the 13th needs a brother." The figure began to unfold. Its limbs snapped and elongated, the safety vest tearing as leathery gray membranes sprouted from its ribs. It wasn't just one creature. 7aided.com. The Jersey Devil wasn't a single beast. It was a contagion, a biological glitch that lived in the acidity of the bogs, rewriting everything it touched. I turned and bolted for the tower, the steel legs of the structure finally visible through the frozen pines. But as I reached the base of the stairs, I realized the metal wasn't cold. It was vibrating. It was humming. And from the top of the tower, 60 feet up, came the sound of a tea kettle. Wee-oo! I climbed. My hands burned as they gripped the steel rungs, but not from the cold. They felt hot, feverish, and my skin was beginning to take on a translucent, waxy sheen under the moonlight. The vibration in the tower was deep, a subsonic thrum that made my teeth ache and my vision blur into a kaleidoscope of yellow and gray. I reached the observation deck, gasping for air that felt like it was made of crushed glass. The small, glass-walled cabin was empty, but the smell was overpowering now. It was the scent of 100 years of stagnant water and the sharp, electric sting of battery acid. I looked down at the hand I had dipped into the bog earlier that day. The skin had tightened over the bone until I could see the skeletal structure beneath. The veins weren't blue or red. They were a dull, glowing yellow, pulsing in time with the whistle coming from the roof. My fingers were stretching, the tips hardening into something that resembled dark, cloven keratin. Mother is calling the Count. A voice whispered from the darkness above the ceiling hatch. It wasn't just my father's voice, or Clara's, or the Ranger's. It was a chorus, a hive of voices that had been lost in the Pine Barrens for centuries. The 13th child wasn't a monster. It was a harvest. I looked out over the horizon. The sun was beginning to touch the edge of the Atlantic, a thin line of pale gold, but the trees below weren't pines anymore. In the pre-dawn light, I could see them moving, thousands of long, spindly limbs reaching up from the sand, swaying in a wind that didn't exist. The entire forest was a single breathing organism, waiting for the final sample to be integrated. The hatch above me slowly creaked open. The horse-headed creature didn't drop down. It simply leaned its head through the opening, its elongated snout inches from mine. It didn't have a mouth anymore. It had a vertical slit that was perfectly aligned with the yellow light in its eyes. Elias, it whispered, and this time the voice was mine, not a mimicry, not an echo. It was the voice I heard in my own head when I thought, "The acid is balanced. Welcome to the family." It reached out a long leathery finger and touched the center of my forehead. The world didn't go black. It went white, the blinding crystalline white of the sugar sand. I felt my bones snap and reset, the wet, crunchy sound lost in the sudden, deafening roar of 1,000 tea kettles. I felt my skin stretch until it was as thin as parchment, and my lungs filled with the freezing, vinegary mist of the bog. When the state rangers found the tower 2 days later, they found my truck with the hood torn open and the battery drained. They found my boots at the base of the tower, still filled with tea-colored water. But the cabin at the top was empty. The only thing left was my pH meter sitting on the floor. The digital display was frozen, showing a reading that was chemically impossible. I still work the bogs, but I don't use a truck, and I don't need a map. I move through the canopy, leaping from pitch pine to stunted oak, my shadow long and spindly on the white sand. I listen to the hikers and the hunters, and sometimes, when the wind is right, I use their voices to call them toward the water. The PH is perfect. I whisper into their ears as they sleep in their tents. If you're ever in the Pine Barrens and the air suddenly turns to vinegar, don't look at the trees. And if you hear a whistle that sounds like home, don't follow it. Because mother is always looking for the 14th child.